Hello, and welcome to the Sociology of Sport, Issues and Controversies. This is Chapter 1 this week. What is the sociology of sport, and why do we study it? The sociology of sport is concerned with the deeper meanings and stories associated with sports in society. If you think about this, the past 12 months, you could probably come up with many examples of social issues and concerns that were raised through sport, and how sport actually identified or even brought more attention and awareness to social issues in our society. Using sociology to study sports is very important. First, sociology is the study of the social worlds that people create, maintain, and change through their relationships with each other. But what is a social world? The definition that I have for you here today is that a social world is an identifiable sphere of everyday actions and relationships, such as family, household, a soccer team, an athletic department, a university, a community, etc. What's important for these social worlds is that they have cultural characteristics that tend to define those groups. For example, culture is the shared ways of life and shared understandings that people develop as they live together. An example of this would be the social world that is created at UC Boulder. There are shared ways of life that students at UC Boulder participate. For example, if the college football game is part of your group, the group that you tend to spend most of your time with, if that is an activity that is important to your group, then you will also have certain cultural characteristics that help you create the rules for that social group, such as every Saturday morning preparing for the game, possibly tailgating, that interactive activity with your friends. That will seem to be a requirement for that social group, and thus that is a social world that has a set of norms and rules that are created. So culture, the way we live, the life that we live, cultural characteristics can identify one social group from another and how they might be different from each other. Social interaction, people taking each other into account and in the process influencing each other's feelings, thoughts, and actions. So the social interactions within, say, a specific group that supports the Denver Broncos. Well, many of you are from different cities around this country, and maybe even from cities from around the world. Your social group from, say, Chicago, Illinois, might be one that identifies with the Chicago Bears. So the social interaction within your group may see some conflict. You all tend to support CU Boulder, for example, but you may have other teams or cultural characteristics about who you are that will make you at times in conflict with people within your group. That's just using the example from sport, but as you can see, that social interaction can also include such aspects of religion, gender equality, etc. So that's social interaction. Now, social structure, they establish patterns of relationships and social arrangements that take shape as people live, work, and play with each other. This means social knowledge. This means that you will read and learn things that are not covered in blogs, sport talk radio, ESPN Sports Center, game commentaries, and most everyday conversations about sports based on research and theory. The understanding of researching the sociology of sport is very important, because based on research and theory, these theories will actually be at times in conflict with the dominant narrative of sport. The tone of information about sports in the book by Coakley for this course may sound negative when compared to sort of the positive comments that you read and hear from those whose livelihoods depend on you having an uncritical view of sports. But in this class, we will look critically at sport and understand just how important sport is in society. Now, in order to understand sport, a precise definition of sport is necessary. We will say that maybe a well-established, officially governed, competitive physical activities in which participants are motivated by internal and external rewards. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, this definition distinguishes sport from other forms of physical activities and from both play and spectacle. So as you see in this first part of the definition, motivated by internal and external rewards is very important. Using the definitions in the previous slide, you will see that sports are a blend of play and spectacle. Play, on the left here, you see the focus is really on the participants. Participation, you have players. The reward, very intrinsic, something that you internally want to gain from this. On the far end of the spectrum, you have spectacle. Spectacle requires, obviously, spectators. The participants, the characters can be heroes or villains. The reward, extrinsic. I want to look at structure here. Dynamics. Play is free-flowing, whereas spectacle is planned. So if you're thinking of sport and organized sports, you can see how sport itself can be a combination of these two, from players simply participating to the focus being on the spectators and what they want to gain from the money they pay for participating, joining you, or going to this activity. So sport is a sort of a healthy balance in between. Play versus dramatic spectacle. Play is an expressive activity done for its own sake. As you saw from the previous slide, the reward was intrinsic, something that you hope to gain for yourself, whether it be pleasure, enjoyment, maybe even physical strength. Dramatic spectacle is a performance meant to entertain an audience for the sake of obtaining external rewards. What I'd like for you to do right now is pause this video and make a list of those external rewards. What are the external rewards that are sought by dramatic spectacle? You can make a list that will vary from simple things such as social acceptance. Participating in this dramatic spectacle might be so you can develop maybe a fan base or even just your family's admiration. But they can also be much, much bigger than this. They can lead to external rewards such as contracts, trophies, scholarships, sponsorships, and long-term contracts making millions of dollars. The pros and cons of a precise definition of sport, however, are as follows. The pros allow sport to be distinguished from other activities. Provides a common focus for people doing research and developing theories. But the cons by defining sport in precise terms would actually privilege people with the resources to organize competitive games and the interest in doing so, and overlooks those without the resources or inclinations to compete. Modern sports have 7 characteristics that have not appeared together in the past. This list here on the left of the characteristics, such as secularism, specialization, quantification, records. If you look at different periods in time where we've studied sport in history, you'll see that, for example, secularism, this idea that the games may be for a higher power, for the gods in ancient Greece, or for a monotheistic god, for example. But if you look at modern sports, we don't play sport for gods or God. Some might say, well, there is religion involved. You see people praying. They're praying for the strength. They're praying for the acknowledgement of what they've done on the field, but they're not playing the sport and the game for God. If that were true, then we would not be playing sports such as football on the Sabbath, the 7th day of the week, oftentimes reserved in observation of religion. Instead, it is the highest money-making day in NFL on the games that are played on Sunday afternoon. Now, alternative approaches to defining sports determine the activities that people identify as sports in a group or society. determine whose sports are most strongly supported and funded, especially with public facilities and money. Current research in the sociology of sport focuses on a physical culture, which includes all forms of movement and physical activities that people in social worlds create, maintain, and regularly include in their collective lives. Official definitions of sport, well, these vary actually from one social world to another. Organizations such as the International Olympic Committee, the NCAA, high school activities associations, each have their own official definitions of sport. I'd like you to pause and think of an example. The example I like to provide came down to a discussion or a debate I actually had with another sports sociologist. He said to me that gymnastics was not a sport, that the sport of gymnastics, or the activity of, was subjective, with scoring and judges that can be manipulated in unfair situations. I then turned to him and asked, well, subjective could also be whether LeBron James is called for a foul or not. Therefore, his subjective argument, in my terms, did not apply. But official definitions are important because they are formally supported with resources. For example, cheer, a competitive form of cheerleading, is now considered to be an official sport by high school activity associations in 35 states. This is college cheerleading in the photograph here, which is not considered a sport. Sport and society. Sports as part of society are social constructions that are given form and meaning by people as they interact with each other under the social, political, and economic conditions that exist in their society. Social constructions. How is sport a social construction? An example of that is, once again, who determines what is a sport? But more than that, what resources go to that sport or that activity, financially and physically, such as stadiums, ticket sales, and fans. Sports are contested activities. This means that there are struggles over the meaning, purpose, and organization of sports. There are struggles over the people allowed to play sports and the conditions under they play. The people and organizations that sponsor and provide the resources needed to play sports. A good example for me to give you to understand how sport is a social construction would be to identify the second item here and give an example. The people allowed to play sports and the conditions under they play. Women were for long periods of time excluded from many sports throughout 20th century American history. Thus, an organization or group determined who could not play sport. The great sport myth, though, the reason why we understand and research the sociology of sport is to basically address some of these concepts that are reinforced in society about sport bettering society. The great sports myth. Sport is essentially pure and good, and its purity and goodness are transferred to anyone who plays, consumes, or sponsors sports. Therefore, there's no need to study and evaluate sports for the purpose of transforming or making them better, because they are already what they should be. That is what I call the great sports myth. How is this a myth? Well, how can anyone play a sport? If someone does not have the financial resources to participate in a club sport or a major group sport, then how are they going to therefore better themselves? Or looking at sport in a major competitive aspect, such as the elite sports of gymnastics, figure skating. Many of these sports, the athletes start at a very young age, 4, 5, 6 years of age, eventually going into these major training camps where they're working 40 hours a week, in addition to going to school, but studying, practicing, dieting. There's no oversight of these children. child labor laws that were established late 19th and early 20th century would have already banned many of these club activities. Therefore, is sport really good for society, or are there critical aspects of this that we need to further examine? Sociology versus psychology. In this course, we're going to examine the sociological study of sport. However, it is important to understand that many scholars do still study the psychological aspect, study of behavior in terms of attributes and processes that exist inside the individual. While we will cover briefly some sports psychology in this course, we will mostly examine the sociology of sport. Whose sport count in society? Are Paralympic athletes better than able-bodied athletes? And who decides? Sports are a social phenomenon. Sports are related to the social and cultural context in which we live. Sports provide stories and images used to explain and evaluate these contexts. And sports provide a window into culture and society. So why study sports in society? The most important part of this first lecture that I want you to pull is this social construction of sport and the social significance of sport. Sports are socially significant activities for many people because sports reaffirms important ideas and beliefs, including ideologies, and we will discuss ideologies in just a short moment. And sports are integrated into major spheres of social life: family, economy, media, politics, education, and religion. So to think critically about sports, we need to learn to identify and understand social problems and issues associated with sports. Look beyond performance statistics and scores and see sports as social constructions, and make informed choices about sport participation and the place of sports in our lives. This can be controversial for some. Sociology may create these controversies. Often, sociological research often provides evidence that there is a need to change the organization of sports and the organizations of society. When this happens, there is oftentimes a pushback towards this change. But what is an ideology? An ideology is a shared interpretive framework that people use to make sense of and evaluate themselves, others, and events in their social worlds. In our society, there's a dominant ideology. Dominant ideology means it represents the perspectives and ideas favored by people who have power and influence in society. Once again, let's look back at my example about women and the inability for them to participate in some sports. Certain sports during the Olympic Games early 20th century did not allow women to participate. Running events, for example, long distance. In today, swimming in sport at the Olympic Games, the women are still not allowed to participate at all of the same distances in distance swim that men participate. So who made those decisions? Well, those with the dominant people in society made this decision. Early 20th century, largely throughout 20th century, this was men. And specifically, mostly white men in U.S. society. Dominant ideology serves the interest of people with the power and influence. Now we're going to look at 4 ideologies specifically here, briefly in this lecture today, and then each will be addressed later during the semester. A gender ideology. Well, a gender ideology is interrelated ideas and beliefs that are widely used to define masculinity and femininity, identify people as male or female, evaluate forms of sexual expression, and determine the appropriate roles of men and women in society. Gender ideology is a basis for determining what is natural and moral related to gender. The dominant gender ideology that has long existed in sport are prevailing notions of common sense about maleness and femaleness in a group or society. This dominant ideology, this dominant gender ideology, argues that men and women are divided either as men or women. It does not allow for a study of transgender athletes, intersex athletes, and more. And taking this further, a dominant gender ideology in the 20th century has long existed that privileges men over women, stating that men are more physically fit than women for sport. Not something that largely society would believe today. The next ideology we will examine this semester will be a racial ideology. Interrelated ideas and beliefs that are widely used to classify human beings into categories assumed to be biological and related to attributes such as intelligence, temperaments, and physical abilities. Racial ideologies vary around the world, but are powerful when people use them to classify humans into racial categories. And dominant racial ideology, prevailing ideas about the meaning of skin color and characteristics of people classified in various racial categories. An example of this would be this construction of this racial construction that African American athletes are superior to white athletes in certain sports. This would be a false claim to say that they have some natural, quote-unquote, natural talent. It's interesting because that was a socially constructed idea during the mid to late 20th century as African American athletes started to participate in pro sports and collegiate athletics, and thus also succeeding and doing very well. Interestingly, early 20th century, around 1910, the dominant racial ideology about African American athletes was that they were inferior to white athletes and that they were not able to participate and compete against the superior white athlete, something that was socially constructed at that time. So this is what I mean when I say sport is a social construction. In this example, through a racial ideology, you can see how one group was limited by another based on what a dominant group in society believed to be true. Social class ideology. The interrelated ideas and beliefs that are widely shared and used by people to evaluate their material status, explain why economic success, failure, and inequities exist, and what should be done about economic differences in a group or society. Well, this class ideology in the U.S. is organized around, one, the idea that the American dream is unrestricted economic opportunities, and two, the belief that American society is a meritocracy. It's that meritocracy part that in the sociology of sport and largely in sociology where we critique that and question, is U.S. society a true meritocracy? Can anyone achieve the American dream? Competitive sports provide a vocabulary of stories that reaffirm dominant social class ideologies in the United States. The next example of an ideology that we'll study this semester is an ableist ideology. Interrelated ideas and beliefs that are widely used to identify people as physically or intellectually disabled, to justify treating them as inferior, and to organize social worlds and physical spaces without taking them into account. An ableist ideology is grounded in ableism. That is, attitudes, actions, and policies based on the belief that people classified as either physically or intellectually disabled are incapable of full participation in mainstream activities and inferior to people with, quote, more normal, unquote, abilities. An example of this it can be seen on our campus at CU Boulder. The last part of the first paragraph, to organize social worlds and physical spaces without taking them into account. A great example I like to provide, and if any of you are on campus this summer, you can check this out for yourself. The fountains in front of the University Memorial Center. Beautiful fountains flowing with tables and chairs for students to sit around near the fountain. If you look closely, those tables, there are high top tables and lower tables. So the lower tables are there with 3 3 chairs fastened to the ground, and 1 open spot for someone to maybe be able to pull up to the table that might be in a wheelchair. However, someone who created that physical space thought it was important to buy those tables. Someone else who created that physical space did not put a ramp down to the fountains. Therefore, the tables and chairs are there, but they are completely inaccessible to someone in a wheelchair. Now, characteristics of ideologies. People are usually unaware of their own ideologies because they simply take them for granted, but people spot the ideologies of others much more quickly. Ideologies, they emerge in social world as people struggle over the meaning and organization of social life. These ideologies are often resistant to change. They are complex and sometimes inconsistent, and they change as power relationships change in society. The second one, change is they are usually resistant to change, is seen in gender inequity in sport. Since the 1970s, with the passage of Title IX, which we will talk about later in this semester, you will see that largely women's participation in sports has increased dramatically. But college coaches in the 1970s for women's sports clubs and teams were largely female. With the passage of Title IX, you had these new positions created that were now paying positions. Many of the previous female coaches volunteered their time. And with competition for the pay to coach these teams, there's been a huge decrease of women as coaches as a result of Title IX. Men taking those positions, resistant to change, having more women involved in the administrative side of the college university athletic department. The other part, number 3, they are complex and sometimes inconsistent. That had to do with the example I provided with a racial ideology. Inconsistent. At one point in time, African Americans were largely seen to be by the dominant group in society as inferior physically in sport. But then, with their greater participation and success, there must be something that is a rationale for this dominant group in society. Thus, an argument is made that maybe they are more naturally superior and have various biological reasons for their success. That is not true. Sports are integrated into major spheres of social life: family, education, religion, economy, politics, media. This next slide I provide just as a little example. The one on the left, the husband and wife appear to be getting married, and the man wants to make it to the golf course. Thus, this won't take too long. The slide on the right, just married. These two have integrated sport into their lives so much that that running was an important part of that ceremony that day. The ideal male body. Sports play an influential role in how people define the body and determine the ideal body, especially for men. This is true for women as well. In many competitive sports such as gymnastics, figure skating, there's a specific body type that has been longly, quote, required, unquote, by coaches and judges in that subjective sport. But for men, there's also the ideal body image of hypermasculine identity being exemplified with large muscles. This is something that can lead to a disorder known as muscle dysmorphia that we will examine later in this semester. So there are different approaches in the sociology of sport. Some scholars in the field see themselves as sports sociologists concerned with sports science issues. Their goal, understand sports and use sociological knowledge to improve sport experiences. Other scholars see themselves as sociologists concerned with the social and cultural issues. Their goal, learn about and transform social life in general. And finally, sociology of sport will grow if scholars in the field conduct and publish research that people find useful as they first seek to understand social life and second, participate as citizens in their communities and societies. Why do we study sport? Well, I believe that sport is a microcosm of larger society in a way that we can learn more about ourselves and the society we live in.